Welcome back, and thank you, Rashid, and your guest. That was absolutely fascinating, and some of those issues will definitely be recurring throughout today. Let's go to our next session now, which is basically asking how the vaccination process will contribute to restore trust and a sense of security to restart the travel and tourism industry. Now, it does go without saying that having the most precise and informed appreciation of the health issues and the way out of the pandemic is critical, obviously, as we've noticed already, in investment decisions being made in the travel sector. We have three excellent guest perspectives. We have the Honourable Siandou Fofana, who's the Minister of Tourism from Cote d'Ivoire. He'll be speaking in French and being translated. That's a country that has declared a big push to make tourism a central plank of the Ivorian economy by 2025. And I also believe that the minister has just been reappointed. So congratulations for that. We are hoping that Professor David Heymann, who is an expert and professor of infectious disease epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, will join us. He's a former WHO Assistant Director General in terms of health, and he's also just been to South Africa to aid with the efforts there. We also have joining us, and I'm very pleased to welcome him back, Tom Jones, the Senior Partner from Fin Partners, and he specialises in communications in healthcare. Now, just a bit of context, despite initial fears that the virus would ravage Africa, the continent has remained surprisingly one of the least impacted in terms of infections. There are some notable exceptions, South Africa, for example, and some of the North African countries. They have had a few issues with a high number of infections and deaths, sadly. But in general, Africa remains fairly lucky to be spared the worst. But today, there are still uncertainties around variants, around efficacy and distribution, and the manufacture of vaccines. There are, of course, issues around possible side effects, and then, of course, on agreed global protocol for testing and immunity certification in travel. Huge, big issues. Let me turn to the Minister first. Welcome to the session. Now, you did announce a big tourism strategy in 2025. Obviously, that's been affected to a certain extent. You want 5 million visitors, or you stated you did by 2025, but the pandemic has seen apparently a 70% drop in hotel bookings. So basically, what I wanted to ask you first is, can you explain about the management of the pandemic in Cote d'Ivoire? How have you gone about that?
Ok, merci beaucoup. Disons que cette pandémie qui touche le monde entier, la pandémie à coronavirus, pour la Côte d'Ivoire, nous avons eu la chance de n'avoir pas été suffisamment impactés, chose qui permet aujourd'hui de dire que la Côte d'Ivoire, c'est un peu plus de 44 000 personnes qui ont été infectées, dont 43 400 personnes ont été guéries. Et nous enregistrons, durant toute cette période de la pandémie, un peu plus de 257 morts. 257 morts, comparé aux chiffres des pays où la pandémie a sévi, on peut dire que ça a été contenu dans une proportion relativement maîtrisée. Cependant, la Côte d'Ivoire ne s'est pas arrêtée en si bon chemin. Il y a des mesures préventives qui ont été prises visant à faire en sorte qu'il y ait des mesures barrières qui soient intensifiées. Le port des masques, le lavage des mains avec les produits hydroalcooliques et bien naturellement la distanciation sociale. Ce sont des questions qui ont été prises à cœur par le gouvernement et moi-même j'avais été investi de la mission de construction des infrastructures, de dépistage et d'isolement des personnes contacts. Ceux qui ont été en contact avec des personnes infectées. C'est toutes ces mesures que nous avons prises et pour les malades, les loger quand ils sont dans des conditions de vie qui peuvent être un facteur de contamination. Il fallait rompre la chaîne de contamination. Et c'est ce que le gouvernement de Côte d'Ivoire s'évertue à faire et ça fonctionne quand même bien. Aujourd'hui, nous enregistrons 1000 et quelques cas, mais nous avons connu une vague. C'est ce qui a fait que nous sommes passés de 120 morts à 254 morts aujourd'hui.
Minister, I'm just going to interrupt you so that you can be translated, if possible, by the translator, Joseph. Thank you.
Oh, good morning, everybody. Just want to summarize what the minister said. He said that following the outbreak of the pandemic and the early days, the government has really taken this seriously, and they've developed some strategies to, prevent the largest expansion of these virus all over the country. Therefore, he was even engaged. He was even involved in the implementation of some isolation infrastructure to prevent the outbreak of, the largest expansion of this virus all over the country. And the country has been fortunate enough, because up to now, we have 44,000 people infected, and 400,000 people cured. So this, sets forth how the pandemic has been seriously taken into account by the government for putting in place some precaution measures, like the social distances, the wearing of masks, and vast program of sensitization of the population about the danger of this virus. So today, it has been serious, because we were having 120,000 deaths, but we moved to 257 deaths today. So it shows how serious this virus is in the country. But measures have been taken to really prevent, to work against that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Just one more question for the time being, which is that there is an issue with production of vaccines, because a lot of people have said, well, hang on a second, Europe is making its vaccines, India is making vaccines, China is making vaccines, it's obviously the United States are. Isn't it time really for the continent to come up with a plan to set up at least 2 or 3 production plants, vaccine production plants, to supply the continent and produce its own vaccines? What do you say to that, Minister?
Monsieur le ministre, la question qui vous est posée, c'est de savoir qu'aujourd'hui, il y a l'Europe qui produit ce vaccin, il y a la Chine et d'autres continents, d'autres pays qui sont engagés dans la production des vaccins efficaces à la lutte contre la pandémie. N'est-ce pas un grand temps pour l'Afrique, éventuellement, de pouvoir aussi penser à mettre en place des infrastructures de sorte à pouvoir créer son propre vaccin pour pouvoir éventuellement venir à bout de cette pandémie au niveau continental de l'Afrique? Quel est votre avis sur ce point?
Naturellement, la question qui se pose aujourd'hui dans le cadre COVAX, c'est vrai que nous bénéficions de l'appui des pays les plus avancés, mais au regard du rythme auquel nous avançons, nous pensons que s'il devrait avoir un passeport sanitaire lié au vaccin, l'Afrique va beaucoup piétiner et nous serons en retard, parce que aujourd'hui, quand on fait le point en Côte d'Ivoire, nous sommes environ à 53 000 personnes vaccinées sur une totale population de 30 millions. Il va sans dire que la question de production de vaccins se pose avec beaucoup d'acuité au niveau du continent africain. Et ce d'autant puisque l'Afrique a la chance d'avoir une population jeune. En général, pour la Côte d'Ivoire et pour bien des pays de l'Afrique subsaharienne, c'est une population d'environ 70% qui ont moins de 35 ans. C'est en même temps une chance d'avoir à épargner une bonne partie de nos populations, ce qui explique que nous sommes moins atteints. Mais la question de la production de vaccins se pose en des termes beaucoup plus sérieux. Alors, la proposition, en tant que membre du gouvernement, nous pensons que nos gouvernements devraient faire un effort pour mutualiser les aides sous l'égide de l'Union africaine à l'effet de mettre un laboratoire pour toute l'Afrique et faire en sorte de produire pour l'Afrique pour que nous ne manquions pas à ce rendez-vous, parce que si on doit attendre 7 ans, ça sera beaucoup plus grave.
Thank you, Minister. I need to get Joseph to give a chance to translate that. Joseph, please, over to you.
Yeah, the minister is saying that Ivory Coast is benefiting a lot in the program, in the covert program, which is good, and also it will definitely be a very difficult for Africa when it comes to the health passports to be put in place, because it's a serious issue, and given that Africa up to now, I mean, in Ivory Coast, for example, for the time being, it's only 53,000 people that have benefited from the vaccine out of and 30 million people as a population, which is very, very less in terms of effectiveness. So meanwhile, Africa is quite lucky for having a young population which is less than 35 years old, which is something very important to consider, and in terms of infection. But however, the production of vaccine is something important. Therefore, all the African continents are really called upon to come together and mutualize the aids for constructing some facilities to produce the vaccine that will really benefit for the whole continent. So heads has to be federated and see how best this can assist the whole continent. That's at stake.
Thank you, Minister, for the moment. We will come back to you. On one of the points you raised there, I want to go to Tom Jones from Finn Partners. The fact that Africa is obviously in many ways and unfortunately lagging behind in terms of the number of vaccinations. When we talk about travel and global travel, I mean, what's the score here? What's the issue? Do you think everybody needs to be vaccinated before we can really get back to normal, or what?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Some of the business owners that I spoke to earlier this week in Africa tell me that they're more optimistic than you might believe otherwise from what you see in the news and based on the statement that you just made, Rajan. So I think that when you Google travel in Africa, you get pages and pages of safaris, and we all know that outdoor transmission risk with COVID is very low. And the psychographics of the type of people who are going to those types of vacations or travel destinations are by nature just a little bit more adventurous anyway. But what I'm hearing in large part, and what we're all observing when it comes to Africa, is mostly that of course, vaccinations are very important. And you're right, Africa is behind the curve a little bit. But it's really about the coordination and the collaboration and the communication that's going to really reinstill confidence here with people coming particularly from Western parts of the world into Africa to get to where they can feel a sense of trust, because it's the testing, it's the reassurance that transmission risk will be low when they get there, and that quarantine measures are in place. So I think that it really does come down to communications and reassurance, but absolutely vaccines are going to be playing will continue to play a big part of that.
but in terms of protocol, in terms of communication and reassurance, it does feel all a bit messy at the moment. And obviously, it's a big job to try and get the whole world to coordinate and to conform, if you like. What do you see the pathway forward in terms of re-establishing travel to at least some degree in the next 6 months, say?
Well, I think it's three things. I think it's and I think that Africa is unique in that there are so many different internal measures that they just need to make on the continent alone. So I would say it comes down to three things: safe resumption of cross-country travel within Africa alone, restoring confidence in tourism and hospitality. And then also something that you and I have talked about before is curbing the impact of misinformation. And it's really on that last point, Rajan, that I think is particularly important because, as with many parts of the world, mistrust for vaccines, mistrust for any type of public health policy is ubiquitous. Misinformation fuels all sorts of significant levels of mistrust, particularly with Western medicines, and that's due in large part to historical mistrust of Western medicines in Africa. But and there's been some speculation about the effectiveness of vaccines and alongside misinformation of vaccines. And I think that's going to be playing a big part of that. So, for me, it really does come down to some of the measures, to your question about collaboration and coordination. I think that messages need to be tailored to suit specific audiences, address barriers, and really put to work some of the enablers in these specific local markets to ensure that they're relevant and to ensure that the public health education initiatives are relevant and engaging. And I think that to your point about collaboration and coordination, partnerships between tourism stakeholders and vaccine safety stakeholders really should be established to ensure coordinated information sharing and dissemination. It's just so important. Effective communication and public education will, I believe, help mitigate ultimately resistance to vaccines and onboarding those types of initiatives. COVAX has done an amazing job in that regard, but it's still at the nascent stages.
Just on the disinformation angle, we have a very live issue at the moment, and it's quite an interesting test case for you, I suppose, which is that the AstraZeneca virus is being, that there are a few uncertainties.
The AstraZeneca vaccine?
Yeah. How can we make sure that doesn't turn into a campaign of disinformation? Facts, right? I mean, making sure that we have the facts is really incredibly important here. And you don't see hashtag facts matter for for no reason at all. And each of these companies really are doing, I think, an amazing job. I think AstraZeneca has had some early, you brought up AstraZeneca, they've had some early hurdles that they've had to overcome. Johnson & Johnson just came out, and there were some questions about the efficacy of that in comparison to the other two, Moderna and Pfizer, which was unfair because you can't look at these things in a head-to-head basis. The clinical trials were not designed for that, and they were also designed during different times of the year, when there were different variants or different populations being tested, and the viral loads were different. So it's just not, you can't look at it that way. So it just puts the onus more on not only the industry, but it's really especially on the industry, but also, and why they hire guys like us, but also why, it's really with collaboration and coordination with WHO, the Africa CDC, the US CDC, and other organizations in the EMEA to really help ensure that the public information is trusted, but it also must be consistent because there's a lot of inconsistency out there, and there's different people putting out different pieces of information. And we need to have a viral overload of ourselves of information that's accurate and factual to really overcome some of those barriers that you've just brought up. Thank you. Now, I see that Dr. Heymann has joined us. Hello, Dr. Heymann. How are you? If you unmute.
Yes, I will. Thanks. Sorry, I had some difficulty joining earlier.
That's okay. Now, you are, as far as we're concerned, the best expert we can possibly get on this panel to talk about this. I know you've been to South Africa recently, advising there about vaccination and curbing the infections. What's the latest state of play? If you can just give us a roundup as to how you see things proceeding when it comes to to COVID and the vaccination process.
You know, since we're talking about travel and about vaccinations, what's important is that, first of all, governments are engaged in wanting to vaccinate their people and getting the vaccines out to people. So that's important. If COVAX facility, for example, gives vaccines to a country, then the country must be able to provide the commitment they need to get those vaccines to the people who need them. So once we see that vaccines are being distributed in countries, there will be a great reassurance that things are on track. But what will eventually happen, in my view, is that as countries that are using vaccines, in industrialized countries in particular, see that death and disease are decreasing, they will be more confident in how they make policies moving forward. Right now, countries are looking for equal risk in order that they can begin travel between their country and another country. They want to see that that country has an equal risk of transmission. And once they begin to see that, travel will ease up much more than before. We've seen some attempts to ease up travel between Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, in December last year. But once transmission increased in one of those countries, they stopped that moving forward. So what we need to see is confidence building, as Tom said earlier, trust in countries that they're doing all they can to control disease. But remember also that vaccines are also a personal protective issue. And people who are traveling may want to get the vaccine in order to travel safely, as they do for yellow fever, for example.
I'm hearing, I think somebody, the economist mentioned it earlier on, this whole notion of another pandemic coming soon. I mean, what do you say to that? Is that?
Well, you know, we know that there are risks now from antimicrobial resistance, for example. So if there's a major outbreak of anti-resistant organisms that begins to spread around the world, that could cause a pandemic of resistant infections. We don't anticipate that that will happen, but we have to be ready in case it does. And of course, we have to be ready for other respiratory pathogens should they emerge, as did this coronavirus, and spread around the world. You know, infections come regularly from the animal kingdom into humans. HIV came, it's now endemic. Other infections have come, other coronaviruses have come from the animal kingdom. There are 4 that are now endemic. So we can anticipate that there will be more. And we just have to have learned from this pandemic how to be better prepared.
I don't want to be too gloomy about this, and I want to leave with a positive message, really, which is, you know, if everything goes okay, you know, as according to plan over the next few months, how do you? I'm not expecting you to be a futurologist, but how do you expect to see travel beginning on a bigger scale?
Well, what it will take is confidence of countries that their people can travel safely and come back without infection. That's what's required. WHO will not play a role in that because WHO can only provide a framework that countries can use for risk assessment. But they will not be able to say it's safe to travel to this country or to another country. That will be the responsibility of governments moving forward in making the alliances that they can make to make sure that travel is safe. I think the airlines will play a major role in that, in making sure that travel is safe and that people who are traveling are not infected. But again, it's all about confidence building and trust in each other that countries will be able to move ahead. But there will be no one formula for that. It will be individual countries working with others to make sure that they understand the risk is equal so they can travel there and come back safely.
So we're talking kind of bilateral agreements rather than a universal one.
Bilateral or multilateral regional agreements will be what probably will occur. But much of that depends on what significance we see from the variants of the virus that are of concern right now. Because if those variants do not escape vaccine, as we believe they're not doing, then that will give even more confidence to countries that travel can resume.
David, Minister Fofana and Tom Jones, thank you so much. I wish we had so much more time to discuss this. This is such a pressing issue. I'm sure there are lots of questions that the audience has, but thank you so much for your time. And we'll all cross fingers and hope that we will all meet in person soon. Thank you.
You got it, Rajan. Thank you so much for having me.